A controversial study is raising privacy concerns. An American analytics company tracked nearly 17,000 BLM demonstrators in a few major U.S. cities without their knowledge. And while the study has fallen under some scrutiny, the data suggests that the vast majority of Black Lives Matter protesters were not only white, but were also protesting within their own cities, contradicting claims made by White House officials. RT's Trinity Chavez reports. But first, we want to warn you that some of the video you're about to see might be disturbing.
Today, racial injustice and police brutality protests continue to sweep the nation, but now new concerns over many of the demonstrators' privacy. This after new data suggests that a tech company has been tracking nearly 17,000 of those demonstrators without their knowledge. Just days after the death of George Floyd,
I can breathe.
Thousands took to the streets around the country, marching, chanting, and grieving the death of the unarmed Black man killed in police custody. But while many assumed anonymity in the crowd, little did they know a tech company called Mobile was using the location data from their cell phones to predict their race, age, gender, and even where they live.
Too many Black lives are being lost at the hands of the police, at the hands of people that have no right to be doing this to us, to be treating us this way.
According to a published report, the data shows Mobile used the location data from mobile phones of people who participated in the demonstrations in Atlanta, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and New York to produce a demographic report of the demonstrators.
I'm angry and I'm upset, and those cops that did what they did need to go to jail.
The data broker company, headquartered in New York City, collected the data from 16,902 mobile phones from May 29th to May 31st. The breakdown includes 1,866 devices in Atlanta, 4,500 in Los Angeles, 2,300 in Minneapolis, and more than 8,000 in New York City without any of the users aware of it. So-called day data was collected during non-curfew hours, and then night data during the curfew hours, specifically set to each city. The results, out of the thousands of protesters who attended the demonstrations, of the ones who were tracked, most were Caucasian.
I wanted to be a part of something bigger and just to show that I support the Black community and all the Black people in this, not even in just this town, but in this country. And I want to fight for justice.
The data also shows that most protesters in each city each day came from within an approximate 100-mile radius, with Atlanta having the highest percentage of protest attendees from outside the city. The report also found there was more male demonstrators in all cities, but Los Angeles had a much higher percentage of female participants during the day versus other cities. And according to the data, out of the nearly 17,000 demonstrators who took part in these protests, 8 out of 10 of them were white. And here in New York City, only about 10% of the Black Lives Matter protesters were from out of town, contradicting President Trump's claims that it was, quote, outside agitators who were the ones stoking looting and violence. Reporting in New York, Trinity Chavez, RT.
The use of facial recognition technology has long been a point of contention for the ACLU, who is now filing a formal complaint against Detroit PD after they arrested the wrong man wanted for robbery and shoplifting after using their facial recognition software. The man, Robert Williams, an African-American, had his face wrongfully matched to the store surveillance footage and is the first known case of mistaken identity for this type of technology. Though Williams's case is being dropped without prejudice, his story speaks to the failure rate of this software. So joining us to weigh in, investigative journalist and co-host of Boom Bust, Ben Swan. All right, Ben, we knew this was going to happen. You and I, we have discussed this for years on RT, and now it has happened. Yes. So summarize for us what happened to Mr. Williams and what Detroit PD plans on doing going forward.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because, yes, you're absolutely right. You and I have talked about this for a long time, and the false positives that come up through facial recognition technology. But specifically in this case, here's what happened. So you had a store, a retail store that was robbed, and 5 watches were stolen from it, about $4,000 worth of watches. So police went, they did not have any witnesses, they didn't have anything to go on in terms of like physical evidence, but they did have surveillance video in the store, grainy surveillance video, and they took a look at that. and then they ran that surveillance video through facial recognition software that is used through the Michigan State Crime Lab, and essentially they got back a positive match, which was this man, Mr. Williams. They went, they arrested him, he was held for 30 hours, he was ultimately charged with this crime, and then those charges were finally dismissed. But what's significant about this, according to the ACLU, is that this is the first time that we can say there has been someone who has been arrested solely on facial recognition technology being used to find the suspect, because in many cases you would have other things that would lead you to this person, eyewitnesses, other things that might indicate that the vehicle that they were in, you know, a license plate, something else that would connect them. In this case, Manila, there was nothing else, and completely, you know, Detroit PD blew it.
Yeah. And Ben, I mean, Mr. Williams was arrested in his driveway in front of his wife and small children. His kids cannot unsee that, Ben. And given the spotlight on police brutality right now, I mean, this really could have taken a turn for the worse. Thankfully, it didn't. But given the 100 times failure rate on black faces that this technology has, could the prolonged or continued use of this technology really increase the risk to African Americans?
Well, absolutely it could. Look, as you and I have talked about, essentially the way these cameras work is that you're going to get false positives on one of two groups. It's not necessarily black people. It's either dark-skinned or dark pigmentation for people, or light. The cameras have to be essentially calibrated for one of those two groups. So if you are specifically targeting black people, then you would calibrate it for black people. But if you say, well, we don't want to target black people, so you calibrate the cameras so you don't get those false positives with that community, then light-skinned people, and that can be people who are Hispanic or light-skinned African Americans, or white people, any one of those groups, Asian Americans as well, it would then calibrate incorrectly there. So essentially the technology doesn't work. And in fact, Chief James Craig, who's the chief of the Detroit Police, says that if you went by just facial recognition matches, that the company they use has a 96% failure rating. 96% failure rating. Why are you even using the technology in the first place?
I mean, I don't know. I really can't think of any. I'm laughing, Ben. I mean, this is a tragic story, but really, I can't think of any other product out there. If it had a 96% failure rate, I mean, who would buy that product? Like if you bought a new vacuum, right? And it said, well, you know, it doesn't pick up 96% of the stuff on your floor, but buy this vacuum anyway. Right. Well,
or you can also apply it to hospitals, for instance. If you went into a hospital and your doctor said, we're going to perform a surgery on you, and there's a 96% failure rate if I use that machine, wouldn't you say, don't use that machine?
Like,
it doesn't work.
I don't want this. I don't want to do this. Now, Ben, we already know, I mean, for example, like Amazon, they're saying they're halting sales and distribution of their facial recognition software. I mean, I can only imagine that other big tech companies are going to follow suit, especially in light of this. But now a couple of high-profile lawmakers, Senator Ed Markey and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, both from Massachusetts, are pushing for a federal ban on governmental use of this stuff. And nothing about, you know, private or local, but governmental use. Right. Boston, the city of Boston, has already killed the use of this. Do you foresee the death of this sort of technology and surveillance altogether?
I think we could see it. Remember, IBM is another company that recently the CEO came out and said that they were going to completely end their facial recognition program because he didn't like the way it was being used. It's sad to me that right now that this is all coming up because we do have this push in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so a lot of companies are doing this for PR purposes. And what frustrates me about that is that clearly Jeff Bezos and Amazon did not do this when it was clear the technology didn't work, but when the public wasn't paying attention to it, because he had employees who were standing up and saying it. There were journalists like you and me saying, hey, Amazon's technology does not work. It should not be used. But when public sentiment on other issues comes up, now Amazon just doesn't want to look bad. Right. So they'll say, well, maybe we won't do this. But it's not out of the core conviction that their technology did not work. It's not out of the core conviction that a lot of these politicians have who say we should ban this. It comes out of right now the momentum and public opinion isn't with them, so they're not for it. Instead of saying, I wasn't for this from the beginning because it was wrong from the beginning.
It was faulty, or, you know, who cares about empirical data, Ben? Empirical data, whatever. Leave it.
Yeah.
Ben Swan, my friend, thank you so much for weighing in on all of this.